Sailing wax and cabbages and
leonard
cakes.
king.
Wow, good for you.
What's that from, Beatles?
No, that's Lewis Carroll.
Oh, okay. Tell us
And the
about
great-
that. He's
The
always
reason
saying
you,
something
the
about
reason
music.
you think it's from the Beatles is because Lewis Carroll was a favorite of John Lennon's. So here's a John Lennon. He's putting it lightly when he says, "Quabble in the grass, straw be down the soddy flies, a mow, a mot, a mass, a monk, a mink, a minibus, a marmalady moon, a monk, a mink, a midipus, a mighty midgy spoon. And so I traveled onward, caring not a care, onward, onward, onward to victory and glory for the old 39. Nicholas.
Oh, my turn?
Yes. Follow that.
Am I supposed to? It was really good. Slidey toes, did gyre and gimble on the way.
That's right.
Oh, see where the photo grows in the moments. Okay.
There we go.
All right. So, I think Father Steve's mentioned a couple times that we're nearing the kind of a transition point in the faith-seeking journey, and there are several things that happen at that transition time. One is that we'll be you'll be finding a sponsor for yourself, or we'll be assigning you a sponsor who's going to be kind of coming alongside you and praying with you throughout the rest of the journey. We will also be having a rite in the service I think it's going to be the 11:15 service. No, it's going to be the 9 o'clock service on Advent 1, where we will, it's the rite of admission, so we're sort of formally admitting you to this process. And we'll give you a gift, we'll give you a Bible, and all sorts of wonderful things are going on around then. We also, as we get closer to that time, we're going to be asking you to schedule a time to meet with one of the clergy, basically in the next couple weeks, between now and Advent 1. And this will happen a few times throughout the year. And the basic idea behind it, there's several reasons, but one is Father Steve will, at one point in this series, start talking about the importance of just being able to come and talk to your priest about whatever, doesn't really matter what. So Father Edward, you'll probably remember, says, yeah, you can always have a cup of coffee with me, come out, I'm always available for a cup of coffee. And what that's for is just building a normal relationship like you would with anyone else, so that if something does come up and you need to talk to someone, we're not strangers to you, right? So that's one reason, is just to make all of the clergy available to you so that you can get to know us a little bit. Another purpose for this is for us to just sort of see how you're doing in this class, how you're enjoying it, what if you're getting your questions answered, if you have any questions you don't feel comfortable asking in class, we can engage with you that way. So the sessions they don't typically take very long. We schedule about half an hour, and I'll pass around a sheet today. And it has some dates and like half-hour blocks. And if you can just put your name in a block that you think might work, if you know it today, that would be great. If you don't, maybe take a picture of this and then send me an email with a time that might work with you. Figure out, just set up a time somehow. And if you prefer to meet in person, or if you prefer to meet by Zoom, it's a little box, but hopefully you can fit all that information there. So I'll send that around.
Excuse me,
Yes.
so it's not necessary then, because I've tried to get hold of Kim and she going back and forth, so
Yeah.
it's not necessary to do it that way then.
Nope.
Go on this sheet here.
Yeah, if you just,
Okay.
what will happen is if you put your name down for don't
All
put it where someone else has their name, but if you put it down here, then I'll get in touch with you this week.
All right.
And I'll say you're meeting with Mother Marcella at the time you wanted.
Okay, it's not necessarily just one or the other of you, it could be any of clergy. Okay, good.
Okay.
You're gonna pass the pen too.
I'm gonna pass the pen too, absolutely, so let's get that going around. You don't need to sign, but if you pass it.
I didn't bring my
And then
purse.
the other thing I'm gonna send around is a sheet, and it says, this is a list of the people that I am aware of who have been participating, but if your name's not on here, I apologize, so write your name at the bottom. If you are planning on continuing, yes or no, just a yes or no there. If you have a sponsor in mind, please tell me who that sponsor is. In other words, if you do have a sponsor in mind and you've already asked the sponsor, put yes there. or if you'd like us to register, to match you with a sponsor. And that'll be, that'll be really helpful for us, because it's quite a lot of kind of coordinating. So if I know you already have some, you know, if yes, you're doing it, you have someone, and then I don't have to worry and you're all set, and I can just reach out to them. But if you need us to, I'm happy to do that. Yes.
I have a question. I have a couple of people that I know through some other things other than the church, but they're very busy already in the church. Is this a big obligation of time for them?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So, this
Before
yeah.
I would ask
the
them.
amount of like sort of formal activities that we were asking them to be a part of is very small actually. It's the 3 rites in the church year. So there's 3 Sundays throughout the church year that we're asking them to be present with you, to stand up with you, and then committing to be in touch with you, engage with you, and praying for you throughout the journey. That's kind of like the minimal. Is that realistic? The sort of minimal requirements. However, we're going to meet with the sponsors and kind of give them an idea of some other ways that you could kind of engage with the participants. And the idea is hopefully that for those who, it could be a way of kind of welcoming them in more fully into the parish and inviting them to events and maybe going out to coffee. I mean, there's all sorts of opportunities of ways that you could engage. But if you already have a relationship with them, that might be just more of the same for them.
Yeah. So maybe it would be more interesting for you to assign me
Yeah.
somebody
Yeah.
That's
that
what it
I
sounds
would
like.
meet and learn.
Yeah, that's what it
and
sounds
do.
like, yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
However you'd like to do it. Some people just have a really good sense, you know, I would love this person to be my sponsor. So if you have that in mind, you can put the sponsor down and then, no, I haven't asked them, I'd like you to ask them, that's fine, we could do that. Or if you'd like to ask them yourself, or if you'd like us to, if you prefer for us to assign you.
Is there a drop dead date on this?
Well, we would like them to be, we want them to be there for Advent 1, which is December, the first Sunday in December. And we would like to talk to them beforehand. So
So basically, we're there.
pretty much, yeah, we're like, this week would be great, you know.
Okay.
Or if they're out of town, to like the 29th of November.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, I can still be in touch and see if they're interested.
So we're not picking from this group, we're picking
No.
from people outside the group.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Exactly, yep. And yes.
So, what's the month Sunday that you said that we? that's
It's
9
the
o'clock
first
service?
Sunday of December.
December 3rd.
Is that Sunday that you want us at 9 a.m.?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
And
And I will send this information in an email as well, but yeah, they'll be throughout the year. It will be at different service times throughout the year depending on what else is going on. That's why I was asking Father Steve, but the first Sunday in Advent, we also have lessons and carols at the 11:15 service. So that's gonna be the kind of special event at the 11:15 service. The 9 o'clock service, you're right, is gonna be the special event.
Would it,
We're not there.
now, I have a few people in mind, I'm not sure whether, I don't know even how to phrase the question to start off with. But it's not necessary that they had participated in the faith-seeking journey.
No, it's not.
No.
And they don't have to attend any classes.
Okay, so,
You know what, I think the word sponsor is a word that the National Church used when we were developing this. And I think probably a better word is companion or something, or somebody who just kind of go
that
with
helps,
you.
that helps, yeah.
And
Because I think the word sponsor gives a kind of a
Yeah. The thing that you get, the sponsor comes from, of course, is like if you've had sponsors for baptisms or, you know,
right,
Yes.
a rite in the service, they come up with you.
right,
And that's the role that they're gonna play. But
yeah. I
So they
think-
would be expected to be hopefully here on each of these days.
Right.
Okay, so
But they
that's
don't-
one question.
But they don't have to come every Sunday to the sessions. They're
No,
more
no.
than welcome to if they'd like to, but they don't have to come every Sunday to these faith-seeking journey sessions.
Oh, no, I'm not worried about that, but there are 4 days that you would really want them to be
I
present.
think, I think
Yes.
that's the number.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
I
For
think
the
so.
commitment, you
If
want them to
we-
commit to all the.
And so it might be easier if you have someone in mind, but you're a little not
Yeah.
sure how to say it. Just say, I have someone in mind, put them down, and then I'd like
okay,
you to reach out, and then that way I can explain, I
Okay.
can send them all the
Okay.
details, these are the days and all that. Yes,
Yeah, these blocks are not very big, so all I did was put in my name and
I'd like to meet in person.
Okay.
How do I let you know? I'd like you to assign me a sponsor and I guess.
That's gonna be on this one. I have another sheet going around, sorry.
Got it,
Yeah.
no, my bad.
No, it's
said
good,
that.
but you got it in there,
Yeah,
okay?
senior moment.
No, not at all. So I'll send this one around as well,
Do
yeah.
I need to sign that?
Yes, please,
Nicholas, quick question. So if we're a couple,
yes.
how does that work? Do we get one or should John get one and I get one?
You can do, that's a great question, you can do it any which way, right? You can do, typically we'll assign either one individual or a couple to be your sponsors. But you can, if you'd rather have separate, that's fine too.
But it's not necessary.
What's recommended?
I like the idea of each person having their own just because you develop a relationship with somebody, but that's just entirely up to you. Some people really feel strongly about not doing it that way, and others are very grateful for the opportunity. So,
Do we?
Would you pass that around?
Sorry.
Yeah.
go ahead, do.
There's not an extra pen, I think there might be over here somewhere.
I get it.
That's okay.
Yes,
Yeah, now that you said that it's Sunday, December 3rd, that we'll be
I
in
need that
front of
one.
the church that, and we're out of
Out of
town
town.
taking care of grandchildren. So how do we handle that?
well, you can't do anything about that. I mean, the only thing you do is, I mean, what I try to say to people is, imagine you were signing up for a class at the local college, you know. There are gonna be times when you have to miss class, just because of work or family or illness or
This is my
whatever.
pen.
But in general, it's a commitment, exactly like. But in general, it's a commitment. If somebody says, I wanna take you out to dinner, let's go play golf, you say, no, I
Right,
do.
right.
Yeah, that's-
So in that case, you obviously won't be able to be there in person, but if you can let me know, then I won't be waiting for you. And I can tell your sponsor too that you won't be there in person. And,
We won't be there.
right, yeah. If you could make a note or send me an email, that would be great.
Gosh, faith seeking is losing to grandchildren, who would have thought?
I know, well, that's not bad.
So a couple other questions. So on the list, it should be, individual to meet with one of the clergy, right?
Yes.
Right, not just as a couple, right?
I'm gonna take
December 3rd,
You had
Sunday.
Per Sunday.
bio sheet that you asked us to fill out and bring back, and I forgot to bring it back.
Okay,
Can I just send it to you?
yeah, that's great, that's great.
One last question. I'm gonna put down the name of a person, but I really do not want to be any kind of a burden on either, there's two of them, either he or her, in any kind of a way. I've known them for such a really, really long time. And it needs to be really easy when you ask them that, hey, it's okay. It's okay.
If you say
Friendships
no.
are not gonna be shattered or anything like that.
Right,
So,
Right on, yeah.
okay,
sure, I can do that.
all right.
Yeah,
I think all these people
Although
are
if
sitting
you
there,
really
right?
wanna give them that, saying it yourself would be, you can
Well,
be
I-
assured that you're gonna say it the way you want. If-
I did a kind of a real beat around the bush type question with, a couple weeks ago. But I mean, they had no idea what I was talking about.
Yeah,
So,
well, what I can do is I can send the information and then you can say, I think you received an email from Father Nicholas with some details. Did
I can do that,
Did I
yeah.
send, I don't want you to feel obligated.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, oh, okay, and then we'll default into somebody
Yeah.
else, okay.
Okay.
So,
All right, well, so that form is going around. If you have any questions about that, let me know, send me an email, give me a call.
Yeah.
And we'll set up times and it's nothing to be, there's no anxiety about those clergy meetings. We're not gonna grill you or anything. This is just an opportunity for you to ask us any questions that you might have.
If we meet
There's
in
a
person,
form
where
going around
do
for
we
your
meet?
sign.
Then you would just come here, yeah.
In this room?
Well, we would probably meet in our offices,
Okay.
yeah. But we can set that up when I set up the meetings, I'll tell you the meeting place and everything.
Okay.
Yeah. All right.
okay, we'll go through the next 1,000 years today.
okay.
Just to kind of summarize, what? Summarize what we have been talking about is really the church up to about the year 1054, which was when the first sort of division within the church occurred between the Eastern Church, what we call the Orthodox churches, that include the Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox and so forth, and the Western churches, or rather the Western Church, which at the time we're talking about now was all one church. It's interesting to think about that the church existed as really a single body from the first Easter through until for the first 1,000 years of the church's life. And the division between the East and West was, as we talked about last week, a gradual thing. And because the Western Empire from the about in the 4th and 5th century was collapsing. As I described last week, the Vandals and Germanic tribes coming down from Germany into Italy were overrunning parts of the empire. And finally, the date that's conventionally given is around 476. The middle of the 5th century is the time that's sort of dated as the date of the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. That is a gross oversimplification. In fact, the Emperor Constantine, in the beginning, first early years of the 4th century, had realized that the Roman Empire had gotten so vast that it was impossible to be administered by one from one place. And so he established a city which he modestly named after himself, Constantinople. Constantine Opolis, like polis is the word for city. So it's the city of Constantine, and it is now Istanbul, thank you, Istanbul. And by the way, I learned just a few years ago that Istanbul is a corruption of the word Istanpolos. And it comes from when people would say, which way to the city, somebody who spoke Greek would say, Istanpolis, that's the way to the city. And so that became Istanbul.
Steve, I'm a little confused. Why are the Greeks so prominent in all this? That's the part of history I'm not understanding.
Okay, that's a great question. So,
Can you repeat the question? We can't.
yeah, why are the Greeks so prominent? And I suppose the easiest and quickest answer is to say on account of Alexander the Great. Around the middle of the 4th century, or early part of the 4th century, in 323 or so, Alexander the Great, coming from Macedonia up in the northern part of what we call the hill country up there, began a conquest. As a young man, I don't think he was over 20 when he started. And
Alexander the Great, right?
Alexander the Great, exactly. His father was Philip of Macedon, who was also a general, but nothing compared to his son. And his son conquered most of the known world. In fact, he conquered all of Jerusalem and Judea and Iraq and so forth. It's said that he got to the Ganges River in India and sat down and wept that there were no more worlds to conquer. He was really, but the other thing about Alexander the Great, and to your question, is that he had been a student of Aristotle. I don't just mean that he had read Aristotle. Aristotle was his teacher.
Okay.
And so he had developed a love, and not only I suppose you would call him a Greek chauvinist. He really believed that Greek culture and literature was superior, and that what he really needed to do was to make everybody else Greeks. And so that they could be, he thought he would be doing them a great favor if they could do that. And as a matter of fact, he established the Greek language as what we've called what's called the lingua franca. That is the sort of, different periods go through. For a while in the 18th century, I think French was sort of the diplomatic language of the West. And since World War II particularly, English has been spoken, I mean, all over the world. You don't really need a lot of other languages as you go through Europe, and maybe other places too, with English. And there's sometimes I'll say, they say, this is talking to my wife, they say, and I'll say something, and she says, who's they?
Yeah, I see that's part of it.
And I always say, on dit, which is a French expression, that means one says, we don't have anything like that in English.
No, we need to.
And every time I say on dit, she rolls her eyes, and that's the end of that conversation. So, as the two empires split, and by the way, so Greek language, Greek literature, Greek philosophy, all of that began to influence not only the lands where Greek was spoken, including, I should say, the Holy Land. So that the Gospels, by the time they're written, are written in Greek, not in Hebrew. Jesus spoke a dialect of Hebrew, which is called Aramaic, but when the Gospels were written, they were written in Greek.
Right, that's what you said, yeah.
Yeah, so
Alexander the Great.
established this administrative. The thing is, I think Alexander died when he was 35. So by the time Alexander died, his empire had to be divided up into different administrative districts. And when that happens, there's always trouble, and there was, over and over again. But one of the things that he was successful in doing was establishing the Greek language and much of Greek culture. Temples began to be built in the Greek style. They had, stadiums that were on the Greek style. People spoke Greek or at least wrote Greek, including the gospel writers in St. Paul and
Yeah,
the
that's why I
Gospels.
don't understand this.
Yeah. Now, the other thing that I can say is because the Western Empire spoke Latin, continued to speak Latin. When I say the Western Empire, I'm not talking about Greece and East, I'm talking about Italy and West. That empire, the Western Empire, continued to be ruled by Rome or governed by Rome. The Eastern Empire was governed by the emperor in Constantinople. As the Western Empire collapsed and as communication between the East and the West grew more difficult, the people grew farther apart. And I mentioned last week one example of that, which is the writings of St. Augustine, who by and large, though he wrote in Latin, partly because he wrote in Latin and partly just because of the times, was not read so much in the Greek, in the Greek culture as he was in the West. By the way, the dividing line between the Eastern and Western Empire, the Greek-speaking East, the Latin-speaking West, goes right through Sarajevo.
Oh, interesting.
The Serbs are Greek Orthodox, the Croats are Latins. The Croats sided with Hitler, carried out purges against the Serbs, and when the Yugoslavia fell, the Serbs said, now's our chance, and they went after the Croats. So, some of these things, when people tell you history is irrelevant, have them turn on the news. So one thing I should say about the development of the spirituality of the East and the West in this period from say 500 to 1000 is that as the Western Church collapsed, or rather as the Western Empire collapsed, the church emerged as basically the only wheel in town. And at the same time, the experience of living in the West was very different from the experience of living in the East. In the East, it was a heyday. It was a thriving culture. The civilization was continuing. The emperor was seated, there in Constantinople. But in the West, because the West was so fractured, the Pope and the clergy and the churches and were the only kind of institutions that were still in existence. In addition to that, as we get closer into the Middle Ages, the bubonic plague hits. We've lived through, a little tiny bit of a plague ourselves with COVID. And we can see how it can really impact. I think at the height of COVID, the mortality rate was about 1.5% or 2%, if I'm not mistaken. So that's how many people 2% can be affected by COVID. The bubonic plague is much more serious. I think it was like 30-40% of the population were wiped out by COVID. And so the West's spirituality would emerge very differently from the Eastern spirituality. Let me give you a couple of examples. And if you've ever walked into an Eastern Orthodox church, you may notice that the church is built in the shape of a cross. You may also notice that over the altar is a dome. And typically on the dome are angels and archangels and all the company of heaven. Right? And if there is a cross in the church, it is oftentimes a Christus Rex. That is, Christ risen from the dead, reigning from the cross, vested as a priest with a crown on his head, his wounds are healed. I'm able to describe it because the church I grew up in had a cross just like that hung over the altar. But the whole idea is that through the death and resurrection of Christ, God has said to humanity, stand up. And so the posture that still the priest does at the altar, which is called the arans, the whole congregation would do, and all of the concelebrants with the bishop at the altar. In other words, the Eucharist was understood to be a sort of participation in an anticipation of the resurrection and of heaven. Pretty joyful, right? In the West, because of the collapsing civilization, because of the influence of bubonic plague, because of the collapse of the structures of civilization, what emerges in the West is a much more penitential spirituality. So although the Western churches are built, particularly in the Gothic architecture of the High Middle Ages, in the shape of a cross, the dominant figure is not a Christus Rex, but a crucifix. Jesus suffering for our sins and dying on the cross. And this was accompanied by a shift in theology in which the people stopped receiving communion, partly because they were afraid they might get sick. And so what do you do when the Eucharist is being celebrated and you're not going to receive communion? And what came to be the practice from about the 15th century was a little book called The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis that sort of is credited with making this shift in Eucharistic piety, that is the spirituality of the Eucharist, is you meditate on your sins. And you meditate that Jesus is dying for you on the cross and you are repentant and so forth. And the other thing that kind of went along with that, again, because the church is emerging as the only wheel in town, as the only institution, as the empire collapses, there was a development that took place from about the 2nd century to about the 6th century. It begins with a Latin theologian in the 2nd century, whose name is Tertullian. You don't have to worry about that. And it sort of culminates with a pope who is Gregory the Great. Now, you don't have to worry about that either. What you need to know is Tertullian was a lawyer and Gregory the Great was a bureaucrat. And so Roman Catholic spirituality and the penitential system developed along very sort of bureaucratic, legalistic terms. And of course, the other thing that happened as the two empires grew further and further apart is that in the East, there were 5 or so churches that could look back to one of the apostles as their founders.
Oh, wow.
Right? There was a church in Jerusalem, the mother church. There was a church in Antioch where Paul had preached and Peter. There was a church in Alexandria. There was a church in Ephesus where John had been, which is up in Turkey. And there was Constantinople, where the emperor himself was there. So the Eastern Church thought of authority in the church in a very collegial way, because there were so many, there were a number of churches that could look back to one of the apostles as a founder. In the West, the only church that could look back to a founder was Rome, where Paul and Peter had both been. And so the Roman Church, the Western Church, developed a much more strict hierarchy of authority than the Eastern Church did. Whereas the Eastern Church was collegial, the Western Church became very not authoritarian, but hierarchical. That's the word. In fact, in Roman Catholic theology to this day, the word hierarchy is a big theological word. The hierarchy has to approve things and so on.
Steve,
Now,
can you give an example of collegial in this sense?
So if a decision needs to be made in the Western Church, the process tends to be that some theologians will come to the House of Cardinals and say, we need to think about this. And the Pope will say, okay, go off and think about it. And there will be a time of discussion and prayer, and the church will think about it. And then at some point, they'll write papers and they'll bring it back to the Pope, and the Pope will say, okay, I think we've had enough. That decision is made now. In the Eastern Church, it tends to be much more collegial. They all sort of have to agree. There was a Roman Catholic Benedictine monk who became an Episcopal priest named Mark Dyer, and he became the official representative of the Episcopal Church to Greek Orthodoxy. And so he had to go and meet with the bishops in Constantinople, or as we said, Istanbul. And he said, when you go and meet, and he was the bishop of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, coincidentally. And so he went and he said, when you meet with the bishops of the Eastern Orthodox Church, it's very intimidating because they're all on these thrones against the wall. And there's so-and-so bishop of Jerusalem and so bishop of Antioch and so bishop of Alexandria and so bishop of Ephesus and so on. And he said, well, I'm Mark, I'm the bishop of Bethlehem. But my point was that one of the big issues was women's ordination. And he said, we've been, and Mark Dyer was saying, we've been bringing this to you and we're waiting on your decision. Can you tell us? And one of them said, why are you asking us about this? We've only been talking about this a couple 100 years. that sense of urgency and decision making that the West has just is foreign. So that's sort of an example.
Thank you.
Now I'm gonna kind of shift gears a little bit and go into chapter 7. Actually, I've if you look at the end of chapter 6, I think I've covered most of the things. But what I want to do now is draw another one of my maps, because maps are very important, and I'm extraordinarily skilled in that is the British Isles.
Okay.
Okay, so you got Scotland up here, this is Ireland, and this is the kingdoms of Britain, and this is Normandy and Europe down here, okay? And what's going on between the 2nd and the 4th or 5th century, or 7th century really, as Gregory the Great is, hi.
Hi,
Are-
I'm just gonna put these over here, because I'm here for the next thing.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
So,
I'll just listen, keep talking.
As the Western Church is sort of collapsing during this period, this English channel between Europe and the British Isles is keeping a lot of developments that are going on in the in Europe and from getting over to England. And so the English church in the beginning remains kind of a provincial backwater in a sense. We aren't sure when or who brought the Christianity to the British Isles. And by the way, we're talking about Britain now, not England. And because Britain or Britannia was the name of this Roman province. And it was quite a developed, it wasn't all backwater. I mean, if you've been to England and seen the ruins, Roman ruins and Roman baths and Romanesque churches and that sort of thing, it was a lot of, very developed church or architecture and civilization there. But we believe that Christianity was brought by Roman soldiers, in fact, who were stationed in Britannia, as it was called, and had been stationed in the Middle East, probably in Egypt. The reason we think that is because the Celtic cross resembles the cross that was discovered in Egypt. And so we think that some Roman soldiers brought Christianity to them when they were stationed in the British Isles sometime in the 2nd century, very early. In any event, when the story goes that there were actually representatives from Britain that were sent to the Council of Nicaea in 325. And one day the Pope walked out onto the balcony and he saw some little children playing, and he said, "Who are they? Where are they from?" And somebody told him, "Oh, those are Angles." And he thought they said angels, and because and he said, no, they're not. He said, they're Angles, they're not, they're pagans. And he said, well, we have to do something about that. So he sent Augustine, not the same Augustine, but Augustine of Canterbury is his name, to Britain. When he got there, he discovered that there were already Christians there. And so he wrote back to the Pope, and who was Pope Gregory, I just talked about as a bureaucrat and administrator, and said, what do I do? These people they're already Christians. They've got a right. It's not quite like ours, but it's close. And Gregory said, where you find that it's congruent with our beliefs and our faith, just let it alone. But if there's something that you need to correct in terms of the teaching, you can do that. That's going to be used later when we get to the Reformation, because there will be people. It's one of the claims that the church has made, that the English church made, that the Church of England was established before the Roman church got there, see. So the other thing that it had, and so the Christianity that developed in England was more like an earlier Christianity that had not been influenced by the developments from Tertullian and Gregory the Great and the institutional, legal, and hierarchical. So how would that look? So let's say that you want to go and confess your sins to a priest. Well, if you're in the Roman Church, if you've ever been in the Roman Church, you know that There are certain times that you're supposed to make your confession, right? And the way it works is you go and you speak to a priest who's behind a curtain and you confess your sins and the priest assigns a penance. Go say 3 Hail Marys or whatever, and you leave. And if you haven't done that, you can't go to communion. So how long has it been since your last confession? It's all very kind of wrote out. In the English church, we had an expression that you may hear again. Who should make their confession? All may,
Yeah.
Some should, none must. So how does that work? So let's say you want to come and see me, and by the way, one of the things Nicholas was saying today about our meetings with the clergy is what we're trying to do is to get away from the medical model of pastoral care. The problem with it is when you go, the only time you go to a doctor is when you're sick. So the implication is the only time you come to talk to a priest is when you're sick. That's why Father Nicholas keeps saying, if you want to have a cup of coffee, my door's always open. This is not like that. So let's say you've got something you want to talk to me about, and you come and you talk to me, and I say, oh, well, that sounds serious. How are you praying about that? And you tell me how you're praying about that. And I say, that's good. Here, let me suggest this. Maybe this would be helpful to you. Try praying like this. So you go off and you come back in about 3 months and you say, thank you, that was really helpful. I've been doing that, but I still feel like I'm stuck. And I say, oh, okay. You know what? I got a book you might like to read. So I give you a book that I think is going to be on your problem. And you say, okay, I'll take a read this. And I'm assuming that this is not an emergency when I'm talking about, right? This is just something that you need some spiritual direction with. So I give you a book and you go off and you read the book and you come back in a couple of weeks and you say, that was a really good book. I got a lot out of that. And I say, okay, how you doing? You say, well, I still feel like I'm stuck. Okay. I said, you know what, maybe this is deeper than I thought. Maybe you should get some counseling. Let me recommend a counselor who's a professional and who's trained for this and so forth, and go and talk to the counselor. And so you do, you go off, and in a couple of months you come back and you say, oh, thank you for that counselor, it was terrific. And I said, well, how are you doing? You said, well, not so good. I'm still kind of stuck. And so I say, well, why don't we just make an appointment, have confession, offer this all up to the Lord and be done with it. And you say, no, I'm not ready to do that yet. So I say, okay, well, let me know. And so a couple of months later, you come back and you say, I've been thinking about that and I think I'd like to do that. So we go into the church. Now, is there any point in me sitting behind a booth like this? At that point? No. So the sort of as a sacrament, the Roman Catholic understanding and the Anglican understanding of confession are identical. The seal of confession is absolute. If I'm called to go before court, I can't reveal anything that has been told me in confession. All that's the same as the Roman. The difference is this: all may, some should, none must, sort of pastoral care. And that's because the basic model of our relationship to God among the Celtic church was that our relationship to God is not hierarchical. Our relationship to God is a community of faith on a pilgrimage, and we're all sort of walking along together and sharing our faith together. And the sacraments of the church are just another resource that the church offers for your journey. So if somebody said they like John Donne today, you remember, well, what's the kind of the most famous, apart from Shakespeare, maybe Milton, apart from those two, the most famous poem in English language?
Canterbury? Canterbury?
The Canterbury Tales.
That's right.
What's the Canterbury Tales? Canterbury Tales is a pilgrimage of all sorts and conditions of people going along on a journey to the shrine of Thomas of Becket and telling stories along the way. Sounds a lot like the faith-seeking journey, doesn't it? So that's one difference. And all of this meant that the English church developed its own sort of identity. Another influence, I mentioned the Saint Benedict, who was who was called the father of Western monasticism, and Benedict's idea of the church was that the church is the family of God. So what he tried to do, now that language ought to sound familiar to you, right? As Episcopalians, we talk about the church as a family all the time, and say, and so Benedict developed not this kind of heroic spirituality. There are no, individuals who climb up on a pole in the middle of the desert and spend a life of prayer in the English tradition. Benedict took the hours of prayer that had been said by individuals and brought them into community. And out of that comes morning and evening prayer, noonday prayer, Compline, and so forth, as something that's deeply rooted in us. There's one other difference. This again has to do with this gap between England, and by now I'm into the 12th century. This was after the split between East and West. One of the things, and I haven't talked about this yet, is the rise of Islam in the East. And Islam not only is marching up from the desert and up into Jerusalem, but it's also coming over to Spain. And they're bringing Islamic learning. Many times they are bringing translations into Arabic of Greek literature, including the writings of Aristotle. And there was at the University of Paris a professor of theology named Thomas Aquinas. And what happened as this literature is coming in here is, have you ever looked at Aristotle? You remember any of Aristotle's stuff? When you were a kid like in 6th grade or something, we learned about phylum, genus, species, all that. That's Aristotle. Everything has got to have its own little label. But it was this massive amount of learning that had been developed before Christ. And it was good stuff. So Aquinas set out to sort of figure out how to mold that into Christian theology. And he did. He published the Summa Theologica, which was a summary of all theological knowledge using Aristotle's model. And all of that never got over here to England. The influence of English and English spirituality remained as it had been, Platonic, Plato, rather than Aristotle. And what does that mean? So there's two kinds of people in the world. There's Aristotelians and there's Platonists. If you ask an Aristotelian to work on a problem, the Aristotelian is going to sit down at the desk, take a piece of paper, and start drawing categories and making an outline and filling in the blanks. If you ask a Platonist to solve a problem, same problem, he'll say, okay, go walk on the beach. So English spirituality remained Platonic. And in Plato's understanding of reality, this is true of Aristotle too, somewhat, but much more sort of imaginatively, I think, in Plato. Worship is not going through a bunch of rules. It's beholding the beauty of holiness, the form of the beauty of holiness. And so one of the characteristics of the English church from that day to this is that we have not produced in the English church a single great theologian. We don't have anybody who can compare to St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas or Martin Luther or John Calvin. Our greatest theologians are poets. Chaucer, Spencer, Shakespeare, Milton, John Donne, George Herbert, T.S. Eliot. Even people like John Wesley and Charles Wesley wrote hymns and sermons rather than treatises or essays or something. So that gave us a different feeling too. And England emerged toward the end of the Middle Ages as part of the Western Church, but with a unique voice and a unique vision of our relationship to God. For us, our relationship to God is not so much hierarchical. The Lord is our shepherd. We walk along right pathways for his name's sake. And the resources or sacraments of the church, spiritual direction, are there to support us in our journey as we go forward. Okay? Okay, let's see if I can get the church right there.
All right, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Here's that
you.
little form. Thank you.